Well, this has been an amazing weekend, and it's not over yet. On Friday night, the Inspirational Choir and I helped lead Shabbat services at Central Synagogue, an experience that was uplifting and hopeful as we were welcomed with such warmth and felt the power of our two communities standing together. And your Inspirational Choir did you proud, Riverside Church. You were awesome. And yesterday we welcomed the cast of Turning 15 on the Road to Freedom to the Riverside Theater. The story of 15-year-old Linda Blackman and her experience of growing up in Selma, Alabama in the 1960s. That young, amazing cast took us to church with their amazing voices and ringing renditions of freedom songs, and Linda was there herself and joined us for conversation. There's another performance tonight, as I mentioned, at 6. Don't miss it. Don't miss it. This show will fill your spirit and it'll give you courage to keep working. And you'll see the stage here. So tomorrow at 2 p.m. we will gather for the 4th MLK Now, held here at Riverside Church. Several hours of poetry, song, and conversation carrying forth the witness of Martin Luther King Jr. Ta-Nehisi Coates, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ryan Coogler, Common. There are going to be a lot of interesting folks joining us, and the event is free, but it's sold out. So there's a waiting list, but you can watch it on live stream, and I invite you to join us. And here we are in worship this morning, a community of people of faith connected to each other with the stubborn belief that God is righting wrongs and working with us together to bring about a better world. In the despair that has frequently made its way into our society and into our lives, especially of late, I want you to know that this community, all of you, give me courage to keep looking for the work of God all around me. Thank you for that. Today's the third Sunday after the Epiphany, the day when a bright star lit up the sky and seekers followed it to the cradle of a baby. It's safe to say that the world changed that day, and ever since, we've been trying to make the journey ourselves, to travel from what we know to what we hope for. And honestly, we often do it struggling for just enough light to see the next step. These weeks following Epiphany are particularly meaningful for us because we are immersed in the human life of Jesus, God with us, simultaneously amazed about the possibility that God could know what it's like to be us, and watching as Jesus translates God's hopes for the world, a place where justice is the order of the day, where everybody has what they need, and where the animating force of love is what draws us together and keeps us together. It's a lot to learn in 5 weeks, but we're here for the challenge, watching Jesus carefully, and as we see him struggle with all the parts of being human, we can draw the parallels from our own experience. A birth, a baptism, and today, a breakthrough. You'll remember that last week we were in the Jordan River with Jesus getting baptized. Well, right after that, Jesus got out of the water and got busy inviting folks to become his disciples. And the very first place they showed up as a team was a wedding. Makes sense for Jesus, the wannabe preacher. If you were a fly on the wall at a meeting of preachers, you'd be likely to hear some truly outlandish wedding stories. That's because weddings are, in my experience, the professional occasion most likely to have something strange happen. My experience has ranged from missing musicians to angry mothers-in-law to drunk uncles to bridesmaids' hair catching fire to a fainting groom. You learn early in this work that if something weird is going to happen, it's definitely going to happen at a wedding. It all started when the caterer ran out of wine. Back in Jesus' day, weddings were a 7-day event. So to be fair, it was probably difficult to feed an entire crowd for that length of time. And remember, Jesus had shown up with 12 extra guests, which couldn't have helped matters. Still, running out of wine would be a shameful embarrassment to the host. So Jesus' mother decided to step in. She knew who Jesus was. She knew what he could do. And I guess she thought that saving a wedding party was just as good of a place as any for Jesus to make his divine debut. And at the end of the day, after the servants went to collect full water jars at Jesus' behest, that's when it happened. All those gallons and gallons of water pulled by servants from the well in the middle of the town, lugged with considerable effort all the way to the party, somehow became wine. And not just any wine, the text says, very good wine, the kind of wine that's usually served at the beginning of a party to make a good impression, leaving the cheap stuff for later when everybody's too happy to notice. The party was saved, everything was beautiful, and everybody knew, if they didn't know already, that Jesus was not an ordinary guy. I think it's fairly clear that the obvious message of this passage is, you should always listen to your mother. It's curious that John's gospel is the only gospel of the four that tells us the story of Jesus at the wedding at Cana. And it's important to note that John would be outraged if he heard us talking about Jesus performing a miracle. For John, we notice God at work in the world through signs, unusual events or experiences that signal for us that something new is on the way. Pay attention to the signs of God at work, John might say. One scholar describes John's perspective as sort of like the upper and lower floors of an upscale department store. Upstairs, heaven, is where all the really nice stuff is for sale. Downstairs, the world, is sort of like the scratch and dent department. It's kind of where last year's stock is still available. And according to John, when Jesus came, he offered us the opportunity to experience a little bit of heaven in a partial way. Will we continue to live in a world filled with greed and scarcity and pain? We're shopping downstairs, but we know what's upstairs because we'd have a glimpse or two even down here. As we live in the world, we get glimpses of what's upstairs, an experiential taste of what it might feel like to live in the kingdom of heaven. The distinction is this. Miracles are occurrences in which we ask details about the specific event. When we hear about a miracle, say Jesus feeding the 5,000, we want to ask questions like, how did Jesus manufacture all that food? What did they eat? Did it taste good? How much did each person get to eat? Did Jesus say any magical words or use a magical wand? Is there a possible scientific explanation for what happened? But when we look at these stories like John did, calling them signs, that's a little different. The details of how a sign happens are not that important. The important thing is that a sign is a clue that points to a larger truth. In this case, the work of God in the world. Remember, according to John, we're living in this sort of experiential, dualistic world. Occasionally, while we're shopping downstairs, we'll see a sign that will point us in the direction of the escalators. It's a glimpse of heaven. What the disciples didn't know while they were kicking back at the wedding reception, thinking about how they had just hit the mother lode, was that Jesus turning water into wine was a glimpse, just a glimpse of what was ahead in the extravagant, reckless, abundant kingdom of God. And they were being invited in that moment to notice the signs of where God is working all around us, and then go there. Show up where God is working and be part of creating a whole new world. I traveled this week to a very rural part of North Carolina for a meeting with a group of colleagues. We were having conversations about organizing for gender justice in the church. And in the course of conversation, one of the folks there told a story that really stuck with me. She is a pastor and was describing a meeting of interfaith clergy in St. Louis, a few years ago, a group that was brought together to talk about this new movement that was gaining traction in their community. Following the murder of Michael Brown, Black Lives Matter had been formed and was gaining momentum, organizing and protesting all over the city and increasingly the country. As is often the case, movements of protest are increasingly born outside of religious communities, and it takes us a while to catch up. The shame of that topic is for another sermon. But such was the case in St. Louis. This movement wasn't going away, and religious communities were increasingly recognizing the critical importance of their involvement in seeking justice for Michael Brown and for so many others who suffer and die under the weight of an unjust system. And so that day, they were gathered in the sanctuary of Episcopal Church of the Holy Community on Delmar Avenue, a large interfaith group of clergy broken up into different working groups. Out in the narthex, the lobby of the church, a group of about 25 was sitting in a circle, vigorously debating one of the most controversial topics of the gathering. The protesters, they were organizing a shutdown of all lanes in all directions of Interstate 70, a large artery that's one of the major transportation routes in and out of the city of St. Louis. By walking onto the highway and shutting down traffic during rush hour, protesters hope to significantly impact the financial and professional communities of the city, to send a message about the egregious murder of Michael Brown by police and the ongoing violence and injustice targeting minority communities throughout the city. Here was the question they were debating. Should clergy members join the protest or not? The group was far from unified in its views. Some were concerned that their congregations would be opposed to them participating. Too radical of a move might look bad to be so closely aligned with such radical people. Maybe a calmer and more responsible approach is better. After all, if we walk out onto the highway, wouldn't we be putting our community at risk? Should the clergy really be doing something like that? The conversation continued, sometimes heated. Clergy there were facing strong pushback from their congregations. Some were worried about losing their jobs. Some didn't even know if they agreed with the protesters at all. But then somebody spoke up, and the group got silent as they listened. A local pastor said, "Look, I don't know the answers to these questions. Many of them are legitimate questions, and a lot of our concerns are real. But I can't help but think that we're here because we're people of faith, trying to be part of God, working in the world to heal and fix and bring about a new order. Shouldn't we be the first ones to look around, to notice where God is working, and to go there as fast as we can? God is working through the voices and the protests of these young activists. If we want to be where God is, then that is where we will go." If you read John's story about the wedding at Cana, you can read between the lines and see that Jesus was having an identity crisis. I imagine it must have been hard for him to suddenly become an overnight success. But it was the people around him who really noticed that something amazing was happening, a sign that God was here and God was working in the world, and they wanted to be part of it. On this weekend in particular, I think it's important for us to read the story of the wedding at Cana and think about where we see God showing up in the world. We see a sign of God in the witness of Martin Luther King Jr. and all of those who joined him in leading and living the work, and those who have carried the torch of the continuing work of civil rights. We see God, we see a sign of God in hundreds and thousands of women all over the world showing up to march and protest and make sure that our daughters have a fair and equal chance to flourish. We see a sign of God in courageous environmental activists and legislators willing to buck convention to address urgent climate crisis. And we see a sign of God in the tireless work of volunteers offering shelter and sustenance, risking arrest to leave water at the border to support immigrants and refugees. We see God in the signs and faces and voices of our children. We see a sign of God in, well, you fill in the blank. Friends, if we want to be where God is, we will look for signs that God is at work because they're all around us. And when we see them, that's where we'll go. Amen.